Well, it looks like Russia has announced yet another limited ceasefire and a handful of humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to flee Ukraine. But there is little to indicate that is actually happening. The two sides met for talks again today. This while the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers are scheduled to meet in Turkey on Thursday. Ukraine's president is calling for a global boycott of all Russian products, including oil. This comes as Russian forces increase their shelling of encircled cities. Meanwhile, Russia's president has likened Western sanctions on his country to declaring a war. Well, with us now to discuss the conflict is Dr. Christian Leuprecht, security and defense expert and professor at Queen's University and the Royal Military College. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
A pleasure. Hello.
So what are the latest updates on the military situation within Ukraine, sir?
Well, what we see here is not much movement in the last 24 hours, but it appears that the Russians are massing troops for an assault on Kharkiv, as well as assaults from westwards and eastwards around Kyiv in an a renewed attempt to encircle the city. It also appears that the Ukrainian forces in the south of the country have been able to thwart, or at least for now stall, further progression of an offensive towards Odessa. But certainly there's expectation that Russian troops will continue to push in that direction and expected a bombardment of that city in the coming days.
And as this invasion continues, we're hearing talks about Russia taking all of Ukraine. So what do you see as the current Russian strategy here?
Well, I think everybody's a little bit puzzled as to what the end game really is from the Kremlin here. I mean, with the troops they have, they've had significant difficulty achieving even their most minimalist objectives. I mean, if their most fundamental tactical objective was regime change in Kiev and taking Kiev within the first couple of days, like clearly they haven't achieved that yet. And we'll see the Ukrainian defenders may well yet hold out and be able to hold Kiev. So in that sense, I think it's not really clear to me how the Russians will attempt to take the whole of the country and to what extent this is just a narrative to reinforce Putin's claims over the whole of Ukraine, and to what extent this is simply bluster in order to detract from the extreme severe misplanning and missteps that we've seen by the Russian military over recent days.
And at the same time, we're seeing NATO handle this very delicately in that it doesn't want to be directly involved in the conflict. Last week, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg ruled out no-fly zones over the Ukrainian airspace. Tell us a little bit more about this move and what it means.
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of reasons for that. The obvious reason is any contact between NATO troops and Russian troops could seriously escalate the situation. I think there's also concern that getting involved might hand a propaganda victory to Putin, because of course his narrative has always been that this is an offensive war, whatever, by NATO against Russia, and so any confrontation there would really play into Putin's hands. But I think there's also very real tactical concerns. The West has provided significant amounts of anti-aircraft capability now to Ukrainian troops on the ground, many of whom aren't all that well trained on that capability. And so they'll assume that anything that flies in that airspace is pretty much Russian assets. So there's a real risk of friendly fire as well. So I think many good reasons why NATO is reticent, but at the same time, it's not clear that the significant risk involved in trying to establish a no-fly zone is worth the, I think, relatively moderate tactical payoff, given that most of the humanitarian casualty are coming from artillery and tank fire, not from Russian air assets.
And as this war continues, we're also seeing a war against disinformation happening, especially within Russia. Tell us a little bit about how Russia's military is really impacting media within the country.
Yeah, so I think Putin has realized he's lost the control of the narrative outside of Russia. So he's really doubling down on the narrative within Russia. And he does this in a couple of ways. So one is to try to stifle dissent, protest, freedom of the press, and also now, for instance, the ability to confiscate assets by people who he deems disloyal to the regime. So this suggests civil servants or oligarchs who speak out against him. So really trying to control that narrative. At the same time, of course, he's imposing, I think he's readying the Russian population for martial law with these extreme information constraints, and probably going to introduce conscription in the very near future.
A lot to keep our eyes out for. Dr. Leuprecht, thank you again for your time today.